Welcome everyone to this week's video. Today we are on Fish Friday number 165 and we have a good one for you today. Today's fish is one of those newer species of fish that I've heard about, but I assumed it was something different. Regardless, it's a really neat fish that you can actually have in your aquarium if you so choose. Today's fish that we're going to be talking about is the Dwarf Malabar Pufferfish, or the Dwarf pea pufferfish, but I don't like that name and I'll explain why in a minute. So the Dwarf Malabar Pufferfish, or a scientific name Tetraodon imitator, again that's Tetraodon imitator, is part of the family Tetraodontidae, which is the family of pufferfish. This is one of the few species of pufferfish in the world that are found in freshwater, as we are on a freshwater week. And it's really interesting because a lot of people think of pufferfish, they think the ocean, they think those big spikes. This is not one of those. And you might know why if you had watched if you've been a fan of the channel for quite a long time. But again, we'll get into this. But as I said, this is a relatively new species. In fact, this species was only described, was described in 1999 from specimens in an aquarium, and from an aquarium in Germany, actually. So when you think about that, you know, so many fish species are out there, and yet this one was only described in 1999, meaning that technically this species has only been officially known to science for 24 years now. Sorry, I had to do some quick math in my head, which is really interesting. It's actually native to the Western Ghats of India, which are also known as a Sahyadri. I hope I said that right. Sahyadri mountain range. We do have a little bit of picture on this of one of the rivers. There's a ton of rivers I didn't really want to get into, but they're really found in the mid and lowland reaches of that mountain range. It's not a large area. I believe I saw somewhere in there that it was around 60,000 square miles, which isn't a large range. However, there is a lot of rivers and streams throughout there, so it could be fairly common. But they're always going to be found in bodies of water with sand, gravel, or stones that make up the substrate. They do seem to like vegetation, but they really prefer that kind of hard or sandy substrate. It's actually, I say they're always found. I mean, that's kind of the only substrate there. Essentially, by my understanding, they're found in basically all the rivers in those. But this is a very interesting fish. Because it's so new, there's no good information out there on its complete distribution, because it just hasn't been studied yet, which always fascinates me. New fish species always really fascinate me, and the fact that it's in a mountain range in India, but it was described from specimens in Germany from an aquarium, that's just icing on the cake. Now this is a tiny fish, tiny fish. The maximum recorded length is 2.6 centimeters, which is around 1.04 inches. Basically, this thing's barely over an inch, and that's the max length. Most of them are probably going to be underneath an inch. Not too much smaller, but when you talk about, let's say it's 0.8 of an inch, that means that it's 20% less in size than the max recorded. So, yeah, it's an interesting fish, but it's tiny, very tiny. Something interesting to note on this fish, though, is that it is actually sexually dimorphic. Males have bodies and fins that are this dirty yellow to orange. And both males and females are covered in dark blotches. But what's interesting is that the belly is paler with a brownish, that becomes a little more brown, and then it sort of towards the mid-body has this stripe that extends all the way through the caudal peduncle. And apparently females do not have that stripe. Males also have a keel on their sternum, I believe, which is essentially, think of a boat keel. That's where it gets the names from. That the keel of a boat is the V that creates that wake through the water. And apparently the males have an erectable keel, which is probably the evolutionary adaptation that's similar to the ocean pufferfish blowing up. They probably exhibit some sort of similar biological adaptations, that instead of blowing their whole body up, they only have that keel. So I imagine that's where it's sort of coming from. Females, like I said, do not have that stripe, nor do they have the keel. Other than that, it seems a rather plain brown with some spots. I mean, but it is still interesting in the fact that it's a very small pufferfish found in fresh water, which is very different than what a lot of people would think. There is a little bit known about the reproduction of this species. It has been observed in captivity. In courtship, the males will actually erect their keel, and they'll actually brighten their colors to a little bit. They'll become a little more strikingly yellow and a little darker brown on their blotches. And the males will actually swim back and forth to a female and try and push the female towards the spawning site. And the female can either say, I like this, I don't like this. And eventually, I also want to point out, by the way, I just thought of, the brighter colors, this to me is going to be more like your breeding colors. You see how it's a little more striking, a little more iridescent versus these bottom ones. I kind of feel that that's what is meant by they brighten up their colors. There is not a lot of good pictures of this fish because it is misidentified all the time, but we'll get into that. Anyway, back to the reproduction. So the male will just continually sort of try and push the female, and either he is successful and she follows him towards the breeding site, or she eventually just completely rejects him and moves away, where he tries to find another female. But if the female is receptive, eventually the female lets the male push her towards the spawning site, and then they'll actually sort of collide their bodies together. I shouldn't say collide. From my understanding, what happens is they get very close together and they push against each other. If you've ever, if you know what stripping a fish is of its eggs, and if you don't know what that is, please go watch that, because there are really neat videos and it's mind-boggling to watch people strip the fish of their eggs. I believe that them pushing against each other is kind of like forcibly stripping themselves. Instead of just doing it in a more natural, they're kind of forcibly stripping each other of the eggs. So they'll push their bodies together, and the female will lay 1 or 2 eggs. And then they'll sort of break and they'll come back together and do it again. And they'll do it about 10 to more times. So think, 12 being normal. That means that the female's really only laying 12 to 24 eggs. That's not a lot of eggs when you talk about fish. However, when you talk about a fish this small, and when you talk about eggs that are extremely small, apparently the eggs are approximately 1.5 millimeters, which is 0.063 inches in diameter. That's an incredibly small egg. That when you compare 24 eggs to that size as compared to a inch-long fish or an 0.8 of an inch long fish, you're probably talking about eggs that take up a lot of the body cavity. So I'm not saying that it's not a lot for this size fish. I'm just saying it's not a lot of eggs when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. But the eggs are laid and immediately fertilized by the male, and they kind of sit there. I believe they probably do them in some sort of protective bowl or cave that the male has made. But there's no parental care. Once the eggs are laid and fertilized, both parents leave and the eggs just sort of sit there. And there is some evidence that these eggs are heavily predated upon. So as soon as they're laid and as soon as the parents leave, it does seem like there are plenty of other fish that come in and will snatch up a couple eggs and grab a few bites. But the egg makes it through, and then they hatch. And when they hatch, this was a really interesting fact to me, is the larvae actually have adhesive cells along the yolk sac. and they just attach to the rock or sand or wherever they at, so they don't really move, and they just attach and stay there until the yolk sac is gone. Yeah, it's super neat. With all these interesting things, the fact that it's so new does make that it does mean that this is one of the least known freshwater fish of the Western Ghats. And it could be an incredibly rare species. You're not entirely sure on there. But for the interesting fact that we're going to end the video on, it's kind of a two-parter. If you've been a fan of this channel for a long time, or if you've been a fan of the aquarium trade for a long time, especially neat and interesting fish, you might think, I've seen this fish before. But you probably haven't. If you were a fan of the channel for a long time, you were probably talking about this, which is the pea pufferfish, which is the most known and most commonly known dwarf pufferfish. They are found in the same areas. These are actually a congener of each itself. They're the same genus. And if you think back, what did I say the scientific name of this fish was? The dwarf Malabar pufferfish. Tetraodon imitator. Imitators, when it's described, means that it is imitating something else. Well, this is what it is actually imitating. Dwarf or pea pufferfish are very beautiful fish. They usually have these blue highlights in their splotches, a few more splotches, more bicoloration going on. But if you were just looking at this underwater at a glance, you could easily see this being slipped into these and not known about it. But that's where it's even gets a little more interesting. This fish was described in 1999, but it was from specimens in an aquarium in Germany. And from what I found on that, the aquarium thought they only had pea pufferfish. This Travanornis, oh my goodness, Travancoricus, the pea pufferfish. And this is one of the only pea pufferfish that I thought was around. But turns out that these dwarf Malabar pufferfish are actually very widely available in the aquarium trade, much wider than I thought. It didn't take me long to find some research, to find some for sale, properly identified. Didn't have good pictures, of course, but you can buy these for 10, 12 bucks, which is really fascinating because you don't know about this fish. You know it imitates this and it probably follows the same sort of biology and ecology, but it's still really interesting. And what's even further interesting is that even though this fish is new to science and still hasn't been sort of classified, it's like I said, it's widely available in the aquarium trade, meaning that the locals who are catching these fish and selling them to aquarists have known about this for a long time and probably have much more in-depth knowledge than the scientific world does. It's really fascinating, and one of the big things I preach, to new people coming into the scientific world is do not take local knowledge for granted. You might have to do some deciphering, but a lot of times local knowledge can be your best asset for scientific research or scientific or for any conservation measures. So it's a really interesting fish, and I keep saying fish that, like I said, was completely new to me. I didn't realize it. I'd seen the name before, but I had just assumed that it was a pea pufferfish, and I was completely wrong. Never knew this species existed. So I hope you enjoyed this. And thank you guys so much again. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. If I don't, please be safe. Have a great day. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you do. I'd really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. Hope you're enjoying the videos. If you'd like to support the channel, please click the link down below. It is by no means expected, but very much appreciated. Regardless, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and peace.